welcome to today's webinar. Our topic today is China Plus One, China Plus Two strategies for global manufacturing. I think everybody is aware of what we've been seeing in the industry most recently, but actually for some considerable time, which is a trend to look at supply chain resilience, to consider how robust supply chains are, and to think a little bit more about who our partners are for manufacturing, possibly starting with trade wars from the last Trump presidency, but obviously going through the pandemic, which highlighted some issues or some fragilities in the supply chain, shall we say, and then through component shortages and the impact those things have had. And it seems when we look at the way governments are operating at the moment and the way sentiment is, there's a bit of a pendulum swing away from globalization towards a more regional approach. And for some OEMs, that means moving out of China and looking at other locations. But for many, it's more about reducing that dependence a little bit and looking at a China Plus One, China Plus Two strategy. So we're going to get into that today. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We've got people coming in as we speak, and I'm sure that will continue for the next few minutes. But in the meantime, I'm going to ask my excellent panel to introduce themselves in no particular order. Kees, can you give us a quick introduction before we go on to talk about some of the specifics?
Thanks for having me, Philip. My name is Kees Engelen. I'm from Holland originally. I worked in Taiwan for the last 25 years. Our company, Taitoma, stands for Time to Market, does end-to-end product design and manufacturing of electronics. And we did most of that in Taiwan, the design. A lot of our manufacturing in China, and these days we are very heavily in Colombia, of all places.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. We'll definitely get onto that later because that's definitely one of those left field spots. Shawn, quick intro.
Yep. Hi, I'm Dr. Shawn DuBravac. I'm the chief economist for IPC and help make sense of what's happening in the electronics industry.
Yeah, Shawn's also contributor to my regular podcast, EMS and the Economist, where we talk about the latest numbers that come out from IPC and the latest trend in the industry. And just recently, we've been talking a little bit about the impact of what's going on in the US in politics, which is always exciting. Pete Mikhjian from Supply Chain Resource Group. Pete, give us a quick intro.
Philip. My name is Pete Mikhjian. I'm the Chief Revenue Officer at Supply Chain Resources Group. SCRG for short is in the business of providing talent. We recruit and deploy engineering and operations talent to help our clients with their supply chain and manufacturing challenges. We've been providing talent for 15 plus years. We've deployed that talent to over 20 some countries. We've got a team of almost 400 some people globally. And for me, I've spent the last 20 years in manufacturing, with the last 10 of those 20 in EMS contract manufacturing specifically. Glad to be here. Thanks, Philip.
Okay, thank you. Just a quick note to the audience, if you have any questions, we'll have a bit of a Q&A session at the end as those questions come in, but put them in the questions tab or put them in the chat tab, whatever's most convenient for you, and we'll pick them up as we go. But just drop them in there as you think of it, and we'll try and get those into the session if we have time. If we don't, the event's being recorded, and I will have the panel look at any questions that are left over after the end of our allotted time to get those answered for you and get emails back out to you. And we'll also follow up the webinar with some more data as we get out there. So at the top of the show, I talked about where we are in terms of the trend, but we're really on the back of 30 years plus of outsourcing to China. And I think, as part of what we're doing, we need to set the scene, because it's that dependent on a single manufacturing region that's been really important. And Case, you mentioned at the top of the show that 25 years in Taiwan. So I guess you got there in the 1990s, last millennium.
I'm old.
At that point, there was just a huge movement to China. Talk a little bit about that and how dependent we became on that single region and how quickly that happened.
Yeah, so there's been this movement where after the Second World War, Japan was making plastic toys and crap, and they managed to work up their reputation to be global manufacturing heroes. Then the Asian tigers came up, and I know Taiwan best of those, and they came up. And while I was in Taiwan, a lot of a big movement went over to China, and I've lived and worked in China, but I've always kept Taiwan as my home base because I love the Taiwanese, I love the country. But yeah, China makes about a third of the world's electronics, I think, and is by far the largest exporter of electronics. And yeah, there is a dependency, and for me, China right now is components. We're a design firm, and the supply chain from China with all the components that they're making there, that is what their real strength is. China has not been the cheapest labor for more than 10 years. Mexico has been cheaper than China for 10 years. And yet very little industry in all that time has gone to Mexico. So China has really developed a lot of capabilities, a lot of skills, know-how. Famously, you have Apple saying like there's nowhere in the world where I can find so many qualified mold makers, for example.
Yeah, and nowhere in the world where you can ramp production at the same speed. I often, when people talk to me about China, I often say they used low-cost labor to kick the door open, and they've used supply chain and logistics to keep it open since, because I think that's a real part of it. Shawn, when you look at it from an economic point of view, it's obviously had quite a substantial impact, and we've seen China change as a manufacturing environment. And as Kay said, it's probably 10 years since it was the cheapest. But that's, brought a lot of people out of poverty, and that's created a middle class there, and that's created a consumer market there. So the economic dynamic of China has really changed in that time. And at the same time, the economic dynamic and the reliance on manufacturing and the skill available in manufacturing has shifted out of places like the US and Europe. How do you see that trend, and where have we got to that we've suddenly decided that we want to turn that big ship back round again?
Yeah, I mean, as Case noted, it was initially a cost story, but I don't think it was just purely about labor. I think it was a story about how do I extract cost from my entire production. And so as a result of that, that made us create supply networks that crossed country borders, relying on countries for where they were best at, but also where the tariffs facilitated low cost of production. And I think what COVID really exposed to us was how long these supply chains were. Not just that they weren't local, but that they spanned across multiple countries, and they were skipping across countries in order to reduce tariff burdens. And as a result of that, it made them very brittle. And I think we saw as transportation networks clogged up during that post-pandemic period, we realized just how difficult it was to move a product through our supply chain, through all the different elements of production, going across multiple countries in order to produce. So I think that's a lot of what companies are reconsidering and relooking at, is not just, a low cost of labor, but how do I create a supply chain that doesn't have to be quite so long, quite so brittle, that isn't zigzagging across the globe in order to save a few pennies. And obviously, especially when you talk about electronics, the problem is in many cases we're dealing with very low margin products. So a 5% tariff or even more, a 20% tariff certainly can determine whether that product is profitable or not for the underlying OEM. So I think there's a lot of dynamics playing out there that companies are rethinking. At the same time, as they start to put in new capital, that new capital is more efficient. It is more modern, and so that also helps achieve some of the cost goals that they want. It's less labor intensive, for example, and so that opens up some flexibility about where they deploy that capital and where they build that capital. China has played a big role. The capital there is aging quite rapidly, and so it's not as efficient or as productive as it once was.
Yeah. Pete, when you look at it from the OEM's point of view, when do you think the OEMs started to become concerned about this? Was it during the pandemic that fragility was really identified, and was that the catalyst, or is it more about trade wars and tariffs, which seem to be ongoing and continuing, or was it about the chip crisis when we did have issues in the global supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good point, Philip. I think COVID started to open Pandora's box. And then as these other global events kept happening, it just further exacerbated the need to look at other regions besides China. I mean, you go back 10, 15, 20 years, the strategy was to consolidate the supply chain, leverage your spend, put it with a few key suppliers, get the best bang for your buck. And then everyone focused on China at the time due to their rates, their workforce, the logistics infrastructure, the favorable open door foreign trade policies. But it's obviously changed. And I think going forward, you're going to see even more of a shift, rebalancing how you want that supply chain to look. I've seen a lot of companies that come to us and they're like, hey, look, we've got 70, 80, 90% of our supply chain focused in region. And if it's not, in region, it's the second and third and fourth layers of those supply chains are in region. So they're trying to, what you're seeing is, still keeping China in the mix as a major supply route, but reducing that dependence. And instead of being 70, 80% towards China, it's becoming 50, 60, maybe 70% China, and then moving the rest elsewhere. But I think you're going to keep seeing that shift.
Yeah. So before we get on to the other places where people are moving that, and there are obviously some really interesting options, including Colombia and all kinds of different fascinating locations. When we look at the economies that have in the past depended on China, and we're particularly talking about the US here, there's been a neglect of the supply chain for some time. But there's a willingness in terms of investment and in terms of government using various different strategies like tariffs or restrictions to try and bring that back. That's a process that takes a long time, isn't it? That's not something that happens overnight. You're nodding, Shawn. IPC are very aware of what's going on Capitol Hill and what's happening in these areas. And I just wrote a piece yesterday about the delays we're seeing in the TSMC facility in Arizona, in the Intel project, in the Samsung project in the US. They've all had substantial investment, but it's taking a long time to get them off the ground. And with maybe a softer market, it's taking even longer. Speak a little bit to how long that process looks like it's going to have to be.
I mean, I think from my perspective, we can hear from others as well, is that it is a long process, and these are long projects. These are long commitments. When we think about putting in a new facility or a new fab, or putting in this type of capital, you're looking at 30, 40, 50-year time horizons. And so I think it's worth noting that the commitment they're making to build these in places like the US or Europe, or even exploring places like LATAM or other places of Southeast Asia, these are really long-term commitments to that strategy. You don't make these decisions quickly, and when you do make the decisions, you really set a strategy around them. So obviously the construction times on these are running longer than many would like, I think for a number of reasons. Construction demand in the US has been very strong, so getting the right workers in the right places is still a challenge. Even as the economy here starts to slow, you definitely continue to see strong investment going into plants and facilities, and so that naturally takes time. Obviously, there's regulatory hurdles that need to be met as well, and other things like that, but they are coming. This is coming, and anytime we've seen OEMs say, "Hey, I don't think I'm going to go forward with this facility or this factory," other companies are stepping in to take their place. So there is a real commitment to this new strategy.
Yeah, and there's a lot of private investment and company investment coming in alongside all those government incentives. But I guess the US aren't alone in terms of those incentives. You're seeing lots of incentives in other parts of Southeast Asia and other regions. And Kees, you're in the Netherlands. There's been a lot of talk about investment in Europe. I think there's a big investment in, again, TSMC have got a big investment, I think, of $11 billion in Dresden. And I think there's something like 5 billion euros of state money going into that kind of thing. So it's happening there as well, but it's a long, slow process.
Yeah, and particularly finding the people to actually run these IC manufacturing plants is not going to be so easy. And you guys have probably heard about the stories of American workers at the TSMC plants just really not getting along with the demands of the Taiwanese management there. In Taiwan, the people in the fabs, they work 80 hours a week in their bunny suits, and they wear diapers because they don't have the time to go to the toilet and take off their suits again. And in Japan, TSMC is fairly successful setting up a fab there. Things are going fast, but TSMC has had a fab in the US for I don't know, 15, 20 years, and basically it has had a much higher cost of production. So I mean, all this capacity building is everybody wants to be want to be part of the super high tech and all that, but it's not going to be cost effective, and it's only going to be used in case there is some big mayhem happening. But if fabs really run on efficiency, and if the efficiency in I just heard a story today that Intel actually they have this $50 million machines, and they just let them sit idle because they were broken, because they didn't have the personnel to fix them, and that would never happen in Taiwan. And if the investments are enormous, so you need to squeeze out as many ICs as you can.
That becomes absolutely critical. And you're right to mention the whole issue of talent and labor force. I think that has a big input rather. Let's move on to some of the countries that seem to be benefiting, and often when people talk about China plus one, particularly when journalists talk about China plus one, they talk about a few countries as being the key beneficiaries, and Vietnam, India, and Mexico always come up as the big three. So let's start with Pete. Let's start with Vietnam. You've got a team out there, so you're pretty aware of what's going on there. we did see some issues very recently on how they'd struggled with maintaining the keeping up with the demand for energy, and issues with respect to that. Obviously, has a big land border with China, so maybe there are some supply chain benefits there. Talk us through kind of the pros and cons of Vietnam as you see it at the moment.
Sure. So, when I kind of go back and I just think about China and where the specific regions are, Vietnam always comes up first. That's the easy one for me. And then, the next thing that I think about is, are we looking at North Vietnam, or are we looking at South Vietnam? Then you start going to Ho Chi Minh City versus Hanoi, and then you look at the robustness of the supply chain that's there, and where Vietnam was maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, versus where they're at today. And I think about the complexity of the products that are being done over there. It's a very viable and easy to do business region. I mean, plain and simple. But you're right, absolutely, Phil, on the energy supply challenges. Their supply chain isn't as robust as China. I think they still have a lot of reliance on China, but it is definitely up and coming, and an easy to choose region besides China as an alternate source.
Yeah, pretty robust. And Kees, you mentioned earlier as the kind of rise of the Asian tigers as we went through that process. Many of those are back in favor, perhaps more than they were. So Malaysia, Thailand, places like that. Indonesia seems to be up and coming. Some of the attractions of places like Indonesia are the size of the population, which eventually leads to a stronger consumer market. Where are you seeing that Southeast Asia region at the moment, as in terms of picking up any business that is exiting China?
I don't really have quite as wide a view as Pete has on the different countries. What I see is that it really depends on what level, what size business you're working with. If you're Samsung or an Intel or an Apple, you can set up a plant in India, and your 20 top suppliers will set up a campus around you and feed all the critical parts to you. And so your top 20 suppliers, they're gonna follow you to Zambia but if you're a bit lower in the food chain, middle-sized companies, then basically you cannot afford to arrange that whole supply chain yourself. And a lot of people, they just stick with their China supplier and see wherever they want to go, because the Chinese suppliers, they feel the pressure. And for them, the easiest thing is Vietnam, because they can rotate their management in and out. It's an easy ride, components in and out. So that is the easiest way to go for them. And whereas, things like Mexico is very far away from their point of view.
Yeah, but we are seeing those investments, aren't we? When we look at companies like Pegatron and Foxconn, the big, the very large contract manufacturers, we're seeing substantial investments, obviously trickling through Asia, but ending up elsewhere. Shawn, when you think of the idea of rethinking part of your supply chain, I guess you've got to go back to some of the reasons you've chosen to do that in the first place. But what do you think are the kind of key criteria that people are thinking about in terms of where they do manufacture? Is it geopolitical? Is it that kind of ally or friend-shoring model? Where is it least likely that the US is going to apply tariffs going forward? So is it those trading relationships? What do you think are the big factors that are pushing those decisions?
I think it's all of the ones you mentioned. Certainly it's labor availability, skill set. it's physical security in the environment. It's intellectual security around IP protection. So it's certainly measuring some of those other risks around the risks of tariffs or the risks of geopolitical uncertainty in that market. It's a look at transportation networks for sure, and how I move goods from that facility to where they need to go. So I think it's a look at all of those factors. I think another thing that we haven't talked about is the changing tastes and preferences of the end consumer or the end business. There has been a shift in how we think about products, and you see it in things like fashion, where we used to try to make one item as inexpensively as possible and distribute that one item around the world. You take a look at tennis shoes, and it was produce a couple of models, mass produce them at the lowest price possible, and sell them globally. And we've changed from that to where now you can go on any of the major sneaker sites and order a custom pair. You can have it designed just the way you want it and shipped directly to your home. So the tastes and preferences of the consumer have changed in a way that it makes sense to manufacture near your end market. And so that's some of what's playing out here as well, is how do we rotate into a place where we're closer to our end market. And that's why I don't think we will ever go back to this environment where it's just one country. We're highly reliant on it. I mean, obviously there is a clear importance of nexus, as Kees noted. You have to have your suppliers nearby, and if you're not big enough to strongly influence that, then you have to have some collective actions that that create the nexus that you need. But when I look at imports into the U.S., for example, China imports for a lot of these categories are down 8-10%. Mexico has benefited, but it hasn't taken all 8 to 10%. I mean, it's distributed across all of these countries that we're talking about. So every company will choose a strategy that might be a little unique to their circumstances.
Yeah. And I think the consumer question is really interesting. And it's not just consumers having different taste in their product. It's a group of consumers that perhaps do consider where stuff is manufactured before they make purchase decisions. And we've talked about this before, Shawn. It's balancing that with the fact that nobody wants to pay too much more. So that makes it a bit challenging. Pete, when OEMs come to you and they talk about China Plus strategies, do they come with a fixed idea of where they think they want to go? Do they come with a desire just to take 20% of their China manufacturing elsewhere? What's typically their criteria and thought process?
So they typically come to us with the preconceived notion, but they kind of keep it in their back pockets. And
they don't tell you about it.
No, and then they ask us to give them, our 2 cents on where we think, would be the right region for them. And whenever we kind of start exploring that, the initial regions, you think Vietnam, I think Taiwan, I think Malaysia, I think Indonesia, I think Philippines, I think India, even Cambodia. So it's that's where we initially think. But past that, that's kind of like the first pass. And then what ends up typically happening is they'll kind of cut it down to 2 or 3 different regions, and then we'll start doing an economic analysis on those different regions and on that specific product that they're trying to bring to production or to transfer from one region to the next. And Shawn started to touch on this. You mentioned it, Shawn, the talent pool. They look at labor costs. They look at average workforce education levels. They look at GDP growth. They look at CPI. They look at trade zone incentives. What other manufacturing companies are already in that region? Who's already gone there first? They start looking at the ease of doing business there. We start talking about legal entity creation. We touch base on logistics, political stability, the regulatory environment, and then once that's established, then it goes into let's compare making widget A in this region versus widget A in that region. That's when it starts going into the total landed cost, and you start looking at facility cost, utility cost, logistics cost. So that's generally how that process starts off. It's that's kind of kept in their back pocket, and then we bring up a few regions, and then we start digging in.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's fascinating. And, the idea that they've come with both criteria, but also, they're coming to ask you a question. They've already got the idea as to what the answer would be. Kees, you're nodding there.
Oh, yeah, well, we had clients that said, yeah, sorry, tariffs, that's really getting too much anywhere but China. And then it really just becomes a question, where is convenient for the client and for us. And yeah, we happen to have a design center in Colombia. And so that is where we now do final assembly, testing and packaging, because yeah, we have all the engineers on top there, and that's helpful. And what I've heard from a country as Mexico, for example, is that you have mom and pop stores and the really big multinationals, and very little in between. And so you're very much on your own, educating all these new suppliers on what they need to do to make a proper electronics case. And China was like that 30 years ago, but a lot of education still needs to be done. And yeah, that's why we picked the place where we have the most people.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's fascinating, isn't it? It's like you say, some people will just follow their traditional supply chain because their traditional supply chain has moved to one place. You mentioned Mexico, and again, Shawn, you mentioned that they were, I think, the largest importer to the US in recent results. So they're obviously picking up quite a lot of that business. There are very few Mexican EMS companies. I think the largest one I found is about 5 million in revenue, and there's every one of the top 10, top 20 EMS companies from around the world has their own facilities in Mexico. It's an important trading partner, Shawn, and it seems to have a very special relationship in terms of benefiting from low tariff costs with the US. I guess that's a key factor with Mexico.
Yeah, I think I definitely the transport. Go ahead, Kees.
Well, I think Pete has quite a bit of experience moving projects from China to Mexico, so maybe later he can.
Yeah, we're definitely gonna follow up that one with Pete. Shawn.
I was just going to add, I think there's a lot of reasons why, companies have looked at Mexico. I think the other thing that we haven't mentioned is that countries that were once pretty undesirable have become more desirable. India has been discussed several times on this call, and 15 years ago, 20 years ago, we would have never been talking about India. They had very little stability and electricity, telecommunications, a lack of transportation, and especially deep water ports. And so as that has evolved, and as the country has grown, it's starting to become a more attractive place to manufacture. Also, as the domestic market has grown, it's going to be a very big economy, even at a low per capita income basis, because the number of people, it will surpass the US in terms of size of the economy. And so some of these countries have, as they've grown and evolved, become more attractive places to manufacture. And that also tends to coincide with the domestic market growing and maturing and moving into a place where they might be able to buy the things that are being sold. So I think Mexico benefits from a number of things. There's still a lot of development that I think can take place in Mexico. There's a lot of economic growth that would be helpful, I think, to develop Mexico further as a very attractive market. But obviously, its proximity to the U.S. is one of its key attributes.
Yeah, it's a key benefit. Pete, let's speak to both of those, Mexico and India. It feels like with
Sure.
India, we've been talking about it as the next China for decades, and it hasn't really delivered. And Shawn already mentioned some of the regions that's been slow. When OEMs do come with this idea of moving elsewhere, they've perhaps seen headlines of Apple making the next iPhone or a percentage of the next iPhone out of India. Is it a country that they are curious about and that they're really considering and expecting there to be lots of talent and lots of low-cost talent available?
Yeah, when I think about India, I kind of go back to like two different versions of India almost, where they were maybe 10 or 15 years ago versus where they're at today. And these to me are different regions if you compare it on that time scale. So while there was some outsourcing that I've personally seen to India, the complexity of the products was more on the simple, more straightforward, very general, maybe consumer type product. So something with a printed circuit board, an enclosure, something small screen, something very simple. But if you look at, today, the complexity of the products is definitely increasing quite a bit. And in my mind, for me, India's kind of it's an emerging giant. It's got a huge labor force. There's a lot of government incentives. The infrastructure is getting there. The regulatory piece is getting there. But they've got very diverse, manufacturing hubs as well. So, you can see automotive products being made there. You could see electronics being done there. You can see pharma products being done over there. And then if I kind of think about the specific regions for India, I go right to Chennai. I think Mumbai. I think Bangalore. Those kind of hot spots to me are definitely seeing a lot of outside investment and a lot of growth. And I wouldn't be surprised if you start seeing more and more products coming from India globally.
Yeah. And to what Case spoke to, if you're someone like Apple and you decide you're going to manufacture there, Foxconn are going to go there, Pegatron are going to go there, but a whole bunch of other tier 2 suppliers are going to follow in. So you're going to build those really impressive manufacturing campuses that we were building, I guess, in the very late 90s, early 2000s in Mexico. You think of the Flextronics facilities that were built around that time in Guadalajara.
Right.
They brought in a whole bunch of suppliers with them and built out infrastructure. Talk a little bit about your experience of Mexico and how that compares and the kind of complexity of the process of moving a project and the potential success or not of moving a project from China to Mexico.
Sure. So when I think about Mexico, I think about the big EMS companies and I think about, the different regions. I think Guadalajara, I think Monterrey, I think Juarez, on the west side of the country, I think Tijuana, I think Mexicali. So yeah, there's definitely some heavy duty manufacturing locations and the EMS guys have all bought into Mexico. That's kind of been there, done that. What's interesting for me is it's easy to place business in Mexico or transfer business to Mexico, relatively speaking. However, what I've experienced is if you look at going from China or Vietnam or Indonesia to Mexico, with the end market being US focused, it's a little challenging. You'll probably be at parity, best case, depending on the product, the size of it, what's the form factor, is it something extra large? So all those pieces to me definitely have an impact on what you can bring and how you can bring it into Mexico. But the ease of doing business in Mexico is pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
But
proximity
what were
is really
some
important.
of the practical problems you encountered moving from China to Mexico?
It's a case, if I think about it, I get, hey, I'm building this widget in China today, and I like to transfer it to Mexico to save costs. And typically what we have is you're really not saving costs, or where you are saving costs, you might, you're giving that cost benefit up somewhere else. So yes, the logistics cost is lower going from Mexico to the US. Then I start thinking about the tariff piece. And depending on the country of origin of the raw materials, you're going to have an impact there potentially. Think about the labor rates. Past that, I think about the cost of the facilities that are over there as well. So all in all, when I think about companies that ask us to consider moving product from China to Mexico, I say, you're probably going to be at parity. But the reason to do that would be to mitigate your risk. Just,
yeah,
that's why you do that.
Yeah, you're
And
not
at
doing
parity,
a
even
cheaper
when you're not,
solution.
excuse me, at parity, even when you don't pay the tariffs.
I'm trying to think of an example case where I've seen it work out, and I
Can't
think
think of
in 10 cases that I'm thinking about, I don't have one example where it made sense. Maybe components, but not final full assembly and then ship. We literally just had one the other day where I had a CEO of another company say, "Hey, I thought I was going to save costs moving to Mexico, literally from China." And this product is something very simple, industrial, and there's some heavy duty thermoplastic coating that's on this particular product. The product goes for municipalities, and they're having a challenging time to find the suppliers that can A, make that product top to bottom, or B, they need to import the steel from China or import the steel from somewhere elsewhere. And then you're getting hit with the tariff. So it's challenging.
Yeah. And do you think there's a desire in Mexico to build out some more supply chain to, because even if you are doing final assembly or you're doing your PCBA in Mexico, you're still bringing in a lot of that supply chain from China anyway. That's, I guess, that plays against what we talked about, that very slow, long process of relocating those very key deep parts of the supply chain. The semiconductors, the printed circuit boards that are
Totally.
China dominant.
Yeah. When I think about specific commodities in China that make a lot of sense, I think about metals. I go right to metals. Large form factor.
Stuff that's not to ship.
Is stuff that you're not shipping. I don't want to ship dead weight. I don't want to ship air. I want to ship something that's relatively small form factor. I can jam a lot of it in the box. I can ship it by air if I really need to, if I'm nervous about timing. But yeah, I'm when I think about Mexico and what they do well that goes into the US, it's something typically large form factor, extra large. It's the shipping cost is almost, as much as the product cost itself. Those types of products do really well in Mexico. That's easy to transfer that over.
Yeah. Before we get into the kind of do's and don'ts of planning how to shift stuff from one to the other, obviously, Shawn, from a point of view of industrial planning and policies and stuff, China doesn't want all of this business to go away. They're also, shifting some of their focus into perhaps some higher value stuff as well. What do you see when you're looking to China in terms of government and policy response and industry response to this migration of business?
I think China for a very long time has realized that the cost of producing in China was rising, labor costs were rising, finding workers was getting harder. And so there was this long push to try to move up the value stream, producing software, doing other aspects of it. At the same time, the manufacturing component had become such a large share that you can't let it all go right away. And I think that's still the challenge that they find. As much as they'd love to move up the value ladder, they they can't let go of the manufacturing piece. And what you've seen them do lately is try to stimulate the domestic demand, giving, you know, they were stimulating the manufacturing, but all of this manufacturing has to go somewhere. And so they were trying to stimulate that domestic demand as well. And I do think that there are a lot of headwinds for China. I think that they will have a lot of headwinds, not just from this aspect, but from a you know, slowing economy, coupled with the headwinds that they're seeing from companies wanting to move elsewhere. You're also seeing China actively look at investing in some of these other areas. You know, I think Mexico will be a very big place that Chinese companies invest in. You know, and as a result of that, you might see the rest of the supply chain in Mexico start to build out and catch up more quickly than we might have presumed, because of perhaps stimulus that they're getting from other parts of the government.
Yeah, yeah. You know, when we talk about stimulus in the US, it's very easy to get caught up in the size of those stimuluses, but we have to remember that the same's happening elsewhere. And you know, TSMC, for example, have had a huge amount of stimulus from Chinese government, from Japanese government, from other regions as well. And I guess, Case, the other thing we have to remember is those companies we think of huge manufacturers in China. Many of those are, like Foxconn and Pegatron, are Taiwanese headquartered companies. We look at the top 10 of the EMS industry, and most of them are Taiwanese companies rather than mainland China based companies.
Yeah, and that is one of the reasons that people are now moving out of China. I think one is tariffs and cost. The other one is the whole uneasiness about doing business with China and loss of IP. And the IP risk is basically be the reason after Cisco started working with Huawei that their stuff got copied one-on-one, and so they didn't want to work with China factories directly anymore. And that is, like you say, the top 10 EMSs, 5 or 6 of those are Taiwanese, because all the Western buyers or the Japanese buyers, they prefer to do business with a Taiwanese entity. And yeah, that is that uneasiness and no longer wanting to do the risk of IP, of having components placed that phone home, of having cranes in harbors that phone home. That has created a lot of negative sentiment about China.
Yeah,
that's components you're going to continue to need from China, but final assembly, that is for me a big reason that people want their final assembly out of China.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to ask you, Case, with respect to the China and Taiwan relationship is, you know, when we talk to people generally about geopolitics, the question of the relationship between Taiwan and China always comes up from an external point of view, where everybody's concerned about it. You were living there for a substantial amount of time. You've probably still got a lot of friends there. How does that feel from an internal point of view?
Well, the Taiwan has been badgered by China for 25 years, and every time there was something on the news, my mother would call me up and are you going to get invaded? And it never happened. So the people in Taiwan have gone a bit, but the pressure is mounting, so it is getting scarier, and there's now a TV show on in Taiwan about what would happen if China would take over, that kind of stuff. So but if that clash really were to come to pass, then the whole global electronics business would be chaos. So that
Yeah, well, absolutely. It's like even too scary to contemplate, isn't it? It's the too big to fail kind of model. Pete, before we finish, because I'm conscious we're getting to the top of the hour again. talk to me a little bit about the do's and don'ts. You know, those customers are coming to you, those OEMs are coming to you saying, hey, we want to shift 25% of our China manufacturing elsewhere. What are the do's and don'ts of the process? And also, how patient should they be? You know, are they coming to you in September and saying, hey, by October, we want 30% of our China manufacturing elsewhere? And you're like, yeah, maybe next October. What are the do's and don'ts? What's the timeline look like on that process?
Yeah, it's a good one. So in terms of, the do's, it's obviously your due diligence. And when I break down the due diligence, you go back to that economic analysis of the different regions, talking about the labor pool, talking about GDP, talking about CPI. Then I think about the government, driven initiatives. Is it easy to do business there? Do I got to worry about, how can I create a legal entity very easily? And then I start comparing on that, total landed cost approach. So that's kind of the due diligence piece to me, if I really had to summarize it. In terms of the, like the execution side, what I think about is creating that staffing plan. So understand what that direct labor and that indirect labor plan would look like. I would start thinking about an NPI launch plan. How do I transfer the knowledge that I currently have to my contract manufacturer to this new region? I would think about how do I transfer or purchase new equipment and be cognizant of the duration it takes for that equipment to get there. I think about purchasing raw materials. Then I start thinking about, PPAPs, pre-production approval processes, first articles. In terms of timing, I have seen easy transfers on something that's very well documented, very well established, something very simple, call it a PCBA in an enclosure, from one facility to another facility that's already established. Fast, 6 months, very fast. Is something more realistic, easy 12 months, easy 18 months, you're dipping into 24 months. And that's if the facility is already there. That's if everything goes somewhat, on time. Nothing to do with like greenfielding a new building or waiting for some legislation to pass. That's if someone says, how long is it going to take me to transfer something? The short answer is 6 months on a fast track, 24 months on something more realistic, depending on the complexity of the product. In terms of don'ts, say don't make assumptions. I would say try to partner with somebody that's already in the region. I think that'll definitely give you a leg up. And besides that, I would say go back to the do's list instead of the don'ts list.
Yeah.
So fair.
Yeah. Focus on the positive, focus on the things that you need to do. And I think, you mentioned those timelines, they're going to vary from industry to industry. You look at just adding a SMT line into a facility that's got automotive approval, that line has to be individually approved. So that,
right.
That takes a lot of time. And it also becomes a talent issue. And it's not just the talent that's there in the factories that you're looking at, it's the talent you have on the ground to support in terms of people that can do inspection and I know that's part of your service, but it needs to be talent that's available in region. Kees, you've moved a few products around in your time. What are your key do's and don'ts?
Well, the process that we have developed is you need to have a portable product, a portable design. You need to own the design. The way we work it now is we design in Taiwan and Colombia. We optimize our BOM for China supply chain components. Then we do the molds and all the pilot runs in China. So you work out all the stack tolerances and the child diseases that you're always going to have. And then only once it's really stable, then we start shipping kits. And in our case, we ship kits to the guys who actually designed the product. So that is very fast. I mean, putting together those kind of kits, that's done in 2 weeks after they arrive.
So it's different process, different scale, different volume, different industries, all kinds of different things. Before we wrap up, I'm going to give you the final word, Shawn. One of the questions I was asked was that should we be concerned about the bifurcation of geopolitics and the industry and what's going on in the world in terms of you know, friend shoring, ally shoring, and those kind of things. My answer to that is a simple yes, but we should be concerned about the move away from globalization. But this trend isn't something that's stopping, is it? It's something that, as you say, it takes decades for us to successfully rebuild infrastructure. But there's definitely a real desire and a real pendulum swing from globalization to regionalization.
Yeah, and geopolitics and geopolitical risk have always been a factor. Companies always needed to take into consideration geopolitical risks. I think there was a period, maybe a long period, multiple decades, where we downplayed what those geopolitical risks look like and how they would impact us from a supply chain standpoint. But it's true now. It was true, 60 years ago. It was true 100 years ago. You have to be mindful of those geopolitical dynamics and importantly, how they shift. At the same time, while we do have a focus on regionalization, I think the real broader focus is on resiliency. How do I create a supply chain that's resilient? How do I create one that's adaptive to the environment, that can be customized based upon the needs that I need? And so there are a lot of factors that go into that. I think sometimes our conversation around regionalization actually masks the true underlying goal, which is to build a modern supply chain that is optimizing costs, but also optimizing on all of these other variables that we need to optimize on.
Yeah, and I think post-pandemic, we're a little bit more concerned about just in case and a little bit less concerned about just in time. And that mix of what you're thinking about when you're looking at a location changes from time to time, and cost becomes a bigger or smaller priority. And sometimes that's reflected in consumer behavior as well as everything else. Gentlemen, thank you for spending the last hour with me. It's been an absolute pleasure. I think it's been super informative. There are a few questions still coming in from our audience, so I'll make sure those are distributed to you. Thank you very much to the audience. I'll remind you that the webinar has been recorded, so it'll be available on demand. You'll be able to go to the same registration pages and register and watch it on demand after the event. But yeah, in the meantime, Shawn, Kees, Pete, absolute pleasure to chat. Thanks so much for your time, and we'll talk again soon. Thank you.
Fantastic, Phil.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Bye for now.